Hello, my friends, and welcome to a special episode of the Financial Conflict Coach Show. I'm Dave Hilton, the Financial Conflict Coach. Now, in this special episode of the Financial Conflict Coach Show, I'm going to share with you a very special presentation about generational, cultural, and gender-based negotiations. Now, this brief overview of these three separate ideas is actually sort of a mishmash of those three separate presentations that I've given on several different occasions. So let's get started. Let's first start talking about the building blocks of personality. Now, it's very important in any kind of negotiation to understand who you are and why you believe the things that you believe. So the building blocks of personality. Now, I thought about using Legos or something like that, but I figured this might be a little bit better, only because I'm a huge art fan. So if you see here, you've got several different colors of things that you can use to draw. Let's consider your personality the final artwork, which is, well, I guess technically never final. It's never actually done because you're always adding different colors, different aspects to your personality. So we start talking about the building blocks of personality, and you can see here that we've got society and geography. Now, those two things, whatever society you happen to be born in, also the area of the planet you happen to be born in, has a lot to do with your personality, as does your religion, your religious preferences, your gender, whether you're male or female, because depending on where you happen to be in the world, that can have a huge impact on your personality. Also, generation, subcultures as well. Now, I'm going to describe subcultures as anything that doesn't have to do with those other 4 or 5 things. Subcultures could be political leanings, whether you're, if you're in the United States, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, whether you consider yourself to be an independent. Maybe you have sports preferences. You're a football fan rather than a baseball fan. All of those are considered subcultures. And so that has a lot to do with building. It's one of the building blocks of your personality. Now, the culture itself has to do with those bottom 3 things: your gender, your religion, and your society and geography. That has a lot to do with the building blocks of your particular personality. Now, as we move on, let's talk about culture. Culture is anything like symbols, heroes, rituals, values, and norms. Now, symbols could be anything from, let's say, the American flag or the flag of the country where you live in. Symbols could be something, a religious preference, the cross, or any other type of thing for different religions. Heroes could be, those people either that are in your history of your country. That's, again, based on your geography. It could also be a part of a subculture, whether your hero may be a Superman or Batman, if you happen to like comic books or something like that. The rituals you have. I know here in the United States, when you turn 16, in most cases, that's the time where you think you're independent and you're able to drive. That would be an example of a ritual that's based in your culture. The values and norms that you have also. The values, whether or not, sexual things are taboo, or whether it's spoken out in the open, it's not a big deal. Whether drinking alcohol is a big deal or it's not. I mean, those, whenever you travel around the world, those are different. Those are two very, very distinct things that are governed by whatever culture you happen to live in. Now, culture, I'm going to go into a little bit of depth here on some of the things that's very important to know, especially in any kind of negotiation. Now, these are just a few of them. Now, I'm kind of going into depth in just a few of these, but it is far from a comprehensive list of things that you need to keep in mind as you're dealing with people and different cultures and different generational groups and even different genders. So your attitude towards relationship plays a big part in negotiations. Now, there are 3 different kinds I want to go over. First off, lineal. These are the people who have respect for the past. They think that what happens in the past is going to continue to happen over time, so there's a continuity to things. The collateral is a group orientation. They're not influenced by the past. They're influenced instead by whatever the group wants. Individualistic attitude towards relationships means that you're self-directed and that you're not group-oriented. Now, time orientation. I can actually do an entire presentation just on time orientation. I find this aspect of culture to be extremely fascinating. Monochronic and polychronic. Have you ever heard of those two things? Well, a monochronic time orientation means that you prefer to focus on one task at a time. Polychronic time orientation means that you can focus on many tasks at once. Now, in the workplace, this could be a huge, huge problem if you have several people who are monochronic. Now, I know in some areas, let's say very specific type thinkers. Accountants, they tend to focus on one task at a time. Polychronic would be people like in the marketing department, because they're thinking about how they could do this, how they could do that, and how that would affect different things in a business. So these interactions between monochronic and polychronic people can be very, very detrimental in some cases. And if you happen to try to work in a job where, let's say, you're a monochronic time-oriented person, and they want you to be able to do this and do that and do that, you will think you are completely being overwhelmed. That's why a lot of times you see in job postings, you'll see them list a fast-paced environment. And a lot of times what that means is that if you're a monochronic person, you probably aren't going to enjoy it. You're going to be a little overwhelmed. Now, having a polychronic person focus on monochronic can be very difficult. Now, it's more difficult for a monochronic person to deal as a polychronic person. However, polychronic people can, even though they don't like to, they can focus on just one task at a time. However, in a lot of cases, they feel like they're wasting time by focusing on just that one thing. Other parts of time orientation have to do with your particular culture. Now, there's an entire book about this, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. Lewis's model, when you're talking about linear active, multi-active, and reactive type cultures. Linear active are those people that are fairly rigid. They have set meeting times. When you say, hey, I'm going to meet you at 2 o'clock, you mean you're going to meet them at 2 o'clock, or you're going to show up 10 minutes earlier. Now, I can give you some examples of some cultures like that. The German culture is very, very linear active, as is the United States. Now, they're a little bit more flexible, but a lot of times, whenever you go to a meeting and you say, hey, it's 2 o'clock, if you show up at 2:15, people are going to be upset. So linear active type cultures are very rigid. And that's why I give that example there of the set meeting time. So if you're going to go into a negotiation and they say, hey, if you're working with that particular kind of culture, they say, we're going to meet at 2, you better be there at 2, otherwise they're going to be offended by that. Now, the multi-active, those are very flexible type people. They have suggested meeting times. A lot of Hispanic cultures are like the multi-active culture. So they can be very flexible. When they say, hey, I'm going to meet you at 2 o'clock, that means, well, 2 o'clock, as long as the other things that I have to do earlier in the day don't take up more time. So you can come by here about 2 o'clock and I may be ready for you or I may not. And in a lot of cases, whenever you're dealing with these cross-cultural negotiations, a lot of times, people who are linear active from that particular culture will get offended if the multi-active person isn't ready to meet with them right at that specific time. A lot of salespeople deal with this as they're trying to deal with people from different cultures. Another culture, the reactive. Now, the reactives. Now, a prime example of the reactive culture would be the Japanese culture. In fact, what they do is they let others choose the meeting times. They're very adaptive. They're able to adapt. So if they're meeting with a linear active and they know that a linear active person is going to be very rigid on the set meeting time, they'll be able to do that. They'll also adapt to the multi-active culture as well. But again, I find this time orientation issue, I could do an entire presentation just about that one aspect of culture. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And once you learn a lot of this stuff and once you really start researching and understanding the different cultures, it completely changes, and it did this for me, completely changes how you interact with different kinds of people. Another thing about culture, uncertainty avoidance. Now, this is a huge thing, especially when you're talking about financial issues. Low uncertainty avoidance means that you can easily take risks. They're fearless. It doesn't matter if you're talking about money. They will risk whatever money they can for big payoffs. Now, does it work out every time for them? Absolutely not. But people with high uncertainty avoidance, they freak out. They cannot understand how somebody else can easily take a risk. They need to know all of the risks involved. They have a fear of failure. They're afraid of the unknown. And most people, they tend to go with a high uncertainty avoidance. They're afraid of the unknown. But you've probably known a few of those low uncertainty avoidance people who they have no problem taking risks. They're fearless. They'll do anything. And especially when it comes to money, that can freak out a lot of people. Now, your context communication. This is low context or high context communication. Low context, that is definitely an American phenomenon. It really started with us, and it's sort of I don't know, infiltrate would be the correct word, but it's starting to go out. And in different cultures, that's why they think that Americans, people from the United States, are extremely arrogant and come across as rude because we don't hold back. A lot of people from the United States don't have filters. There's no guessing about meaning, because if we think you're ugly, then we'll say you're ugly. If we think you're rude, we will come right to your face and say, hey, you're being rude. And for a lot of high context communication cultures, that is just a taboo. You can't do that. Indirect speech, they rely on nonverbal cues. Now, if you've had any study on nonverbal cues, technically about 85% or so of all communication is nonverbal. So they prefer, instead of saying, hey, I don't like you, they'll do nonverbal cues like turning away from you, stepping away from you, ignoring you, without actually saying directly, hey, I don't like you. So when you're dealing with different cultures, especially in negotiations, it's important to watch those nonverbal cues if you think you're dealing with someone from a high context communication culture. So, and another thing is that Americans, we have to tone it down a little. Okay, in some cases, for some people, I think we'd have to tone it down a lot. But you have to adapt. You have to be able to adapt to the person or people or group that you're dealing with, especially in a negotiation or financial negotiation or any kind of negotiation. But that is uncertainty avoidance and context communication as involved with culture. More parts of culture, individualistic versus collective. Now, the individualistic, again, American, very much focus on self. Personal interests are the most important to an individualistic culture. Collective cultures, those are, Hispanic cultures, also some Asian cultures, things like that. They're focused on the group. Group interests, family interests are the most important thing. It doesn't matter what one individual person in a family or that group from a collective culture wants. It has to be consensus-based. It has to be, if it helps out the group as a whole, then you can do it. If it doesn't and it just benefits one person, in a lot of cases, they won't do it. Now, in a negotiation, that's also why it's very important to understand, if you're dealing with a collective person, if they say that, okay, well, I need to go talk to my husband or I need to go talk to my family, that's not a stalling tactic. That is actually something that they have to do. Even though they may have picked one person to represent them in the negotiation, they may still have to talk to everyone before they can actually come to an agreement with you. Now, universalist versus particularist. The universalist type culture, fairness and equality for all at all times. Now, particularist, fairness and equality is situational. Now, this is very interesting. Now, if you ask the majority of Americans, people from the United States, which of these two that they think they are, a lot of times they'll say that they're universalist. But that's not really the case. In fact, most Americans are particularists because fairness and equality is situational. It's based on whatever situation. And if you don't see that, just look at some of the outcomes from jury trials and things like that in different kinds of negotiations. Although we like to say that, yes, it's all fair to everyone, a lot of times that's not the case, especially if you look at the differences between how things turn out for the poor versus the rich, sometimes in cases of men versus women, the young versus old. I mean, there's so many different things. Yeah, we like to claim in the United States that we're universalist, but specifically, I don't think we are, really. We're more particularist in most cases. Not in all cases, but in most cases. All right, let's continue here. More about culture. The locus of control. You may not have heard anything about this before, but you either have an internal or an external locus of control. Now, what this means is that you're responsible for making your own destiny if you think you have an internal locus of control. That means you alone are responsible. No one else has anything to do with it. What you do affects what your life turns out to be. Now, an external locus of control means that your destiny and events are predetermined. Now, this can be a huge issue in negotiations because if you have an external locus of control, if you're dealing with somebody with an external locus of control, that means that they think that whatever the outcome of the negotiation is already predetermined. So you trying to change what they think has already been predetermined is going to be like you hitting your head up against a wall. It's not going to work very well. If you have an internal one, that means that it's a bit more, and I hate to use the word selfish necessarily, but you have more of a selfish aspect that you're responsible for making your own destiny, and people will often negotiate differently based on their locus of control. Another thing, power distance. Now, culture plays a huge part of this, as does your generational group. High power distant cultures have differences in men and women. I mean, if you look at some of the Arabic cultures, if you look at some of the cultures from the Middle East, the men and women aren't equal. And that had been the case as well, even in the United States up through, I guess, just within the last 100 years has that really changed. The young and the old, you'll see a lot of this in high power distance where a young person cannot negotiate with a senior person because the senior person finds it offensive to have to deal with someone that young. They would rather deal with somebody at their same level. So you'll find that, and so if you run into a negotiation like that, don't take offense to that. That, if you're younger, don't think that they're trying to offend you in some way. They actually think that they have been offended by having a young person try to negotiate with them. So you have to make sure that your age differences aren't an issue. And in a lot of cultures, and yes, even in the American culture, the rich versus poor has a huge impact on how negotiations turn out. Now, low power distant, particularist, people are treated equally. There aren't a whole lot of cultures who deal with this because there's always some sort of bias that creates a power distance in their culture. All right, let's continue again. All right, so how does culture affect negotiation specifically? If you've ever heard of the triangle of satisfaction, that's what this graphic represents, the satisfaction triangle. There are 3 points to the triangle: product, people, and process. On one side, if you split this particular triangle down the middle, to the left you would see integrative bargaining, and on the right you would see distributive bargaining. Now, most people think that all negotiations are distributive bargaining, and what does that mean? It's a zero-sum game. It means there is a fixed amount, there's a pie, and you have to try to win at whatever cost the majority of the pie or the biggest piece or pieces of that pie as you possibly can. It's a win-lose scenario, and unfortunately, most people including a lot of Americans, unfortunately, believe that distributive bargaining is the only way to bargain. Now, integrative bargaining is actually creating value out of something that maybe isn't part of the main pie. You're actually creating, you have this pie perhaps, but then you have maybe a little ice cream or something. I don't know why I'm talking about food. I must be hungry. But you have, you're creating ice cream, or you're adding ice cream to the situation to sweeten the pot, so to speak. But a lot of times, the durability of agreements, if you see that down below, your happiness or satisfaction with the 3 aspects of this triangle determine how durable your agreement is, how durable the end result of a negotiation is. Now, the whole point of a negotiation is to make sure that, especially in a business setting, that you're happy with the people, you're happy with the product, and you're happy with the process. Now, how do you describe that? You're happy with the people you're dealing with in a company, you're happy with the end result, the product or service you're receiving, and you're happy with the process. Now, the process could be how you deal with customer service, emails or video chats or whatever it is. So if you're happy with all 3 of those, then the durability of your agreement will likely last unless something outside of these 3 things happen to change that. Now, what happens is a lot of times people become unsatisfied with a thing either because they don't like dealing with the people, and I've used this example in a lot of cases where, let's say you have a salesperson and that salesperson has built a rapport, they built a relationship with a client, and then that particular person leaves or finds a better job and goes somewhere else, or even leaves your industry, and then the next salesperson who comes in to deal with that particular client, well, the client doesn't get along with them. So you have lost one of the important parts of the durability of your agreement here by losing that particular corner of the triangle. So then you're left with, well, yeah, they're still happy with the product, they're still happy with the process, they just don't like the person that they're necessarily dealing with. And you can do that same kind of example for all three. Maybe you're still happy with the person you're dealing with, maybe you're happy with the process, but maybe something has changed, maybe an update has come in you don't like, and so now you're no longer happy with the product. And the same thing about the process. Maybe a company changes the way that you interact with them, and maybe you were used to doing some sort of web form and you filled it out and they were able to get back to you very quickly. Maybe they changed that where now you have to send screenshots of whatever the problem is, and it's more work intensive for you and you don't like it anymore. So now you're no longer happy with the process of the satisfaction triangle. Now, you can usually continue an agreement in most cases and continue negotiations as long as you're still happy with 2 out of 3 of these, either people, product, or process. But what happens is if you lose 2 of them, the chances of you being able to continue that agreement or continue your relationship with that person is going to be a problem. Now, companies have a huge issue where what happens is they start focusing on the people aspect of this instead of focusing on whether it's a product or process problem. So what'll happen is a lot of times companies will fire people and just replace them, even though the actual underlying issue is with a product or process. But to them, it's easier to fire someone and bring in somebody new than it is to actually train or do something with the people that they happen to have. So that's something you might want to consider, the satisfaction triangle. Again, obviously, this is one of those subjects that I could go on and on about, because basically I just did. All right, let's continue, shall we? Now, how does your personal conflict style affect your negotiations? Now, here's another thing. This is another thing I could really talk a long time about with the clients that I work with. Depending on what it is that they're dealing with, whether it's a business issue, whether it's a couples issue, whether it's a family issue, that will determine which of these that I actually have my clients take. The Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode Instrument, that's the TKI. The Style Matters inventory, that's the Craybill conflict style inventory. Also the intercultural conflict style inventory, the ICS inventory as it's known. So that's something that it just kind of depends on the situation you're dealing with. Now, a lot of these, like Style Matters and the intercultural one, has a lot to do with culture. It actually builds that in to the different questions you take. But your personal conflict style really affects negotiations. There are, generally speaking, 5 different personal conflict styles that you can take. I'm not going to go into detail about whichever one, all the different ones, because they are a little bit different in each one of these. But generally speaking, there are 5 different personal conflict styles that you can have. Now, I can tell you that whenever I learned about my conflict style and how I react in simple, stressful situations and extremely stressful situations, it opened up an entire new world to me, because I realized that my particular style and the style of the people that I work with generally in my day job are completely different, and that's why we were accomplishing nothing. So what I learned by understanding my own personal conflict style is how to still get what I want, to be able to negotiate better by adapting my style. And I think this, out of all of the things that I offer to clients, is one of the most important and most useful things that I can do for them, showing them what their personal conflict style is and how it affects you communicating and interacting with others. But I mean, it's a huge, huge thing. If you have more questions about that, feel free to contact me. All right, so let's talk about generational groups. Now, this is one of my academic and professional specialties here, is generational conflict and generational theory. So based on the Strauss and Howe definition of the generational groups, we'll define them as the GI generation, who were born from 1901 to 1924. You have the silent generation, which is 1925 to 1942. You've got the baby boomers, which is the second largest group on this list, 1943 to 1960. Now, some of the dates in here you may have read in different places that they're a little bit off, so there is, depending on which research you're reading, there are a few changes of the dates, but for the most part, the generational groups themselves are the same. Generation X, known as the slacker generation, or Gen X, 1961 to 1981. The millennials, that is actually the largest group on this list. Gen Y, as they're also known, 1982 to 1999. And then you got the 2020 generation, which is born 2000 to 2020. Which we still haven't seen the rest of them yet. So they may, at some point, become the largest group. Well, that remains to be seen, though. So these are the generations, and it's a very unique situation where for the very first time ever, we've got the potential for all of these generations, all 6 of these generations, to possibly still be in the workplace at the same time. If nothing more, then we still have at least 5 in the workplace at any one time. So let's talk about each of these groups. Let's start off with the GI generation. You don't see a whole lot of them still in the workplace. You do see them, though, in like family businesses where they just don't want to come out of the work. They want to continue to be able to work and do stuff. So the GI generation, here are some of the aspects of the GI generation. They're very team-oriented. They were the builders of the U.S. infrastructure. They created the current military command-structured workplace that we see especially in the American workplace right now. Optimistic and confident, very confident in what they've been able to accomplish and confident in what they can continue to accomplish. They see honor and sacrifice. This is where you see a lot of people. There was the GI generation that had the baby boomers specifically, had them in the workplace, and so that you spent the majority of the time working your butt off, becoming a workaholic essentially, because they saw honor in sacrificing your time with your family to help and be loyal to whatever companies that they created. They're very political minded, the GI generation. Their 3 areas of influence in our culture: community, affluence, and technology specifically. Now, members of this group, JFK, Edward R. Murrow, and Joseph McCarthy, all three members of that particular group. So you can see very political in that, very community-oriented. Now, let's move on to the silent generation, 1925 to 1942. These were the children of the Great Depression. They prefer consensus-oriented workplace. They like to have a lot of group thinking, strong belief in fairness, especially civil rights. You see a lot of that from this particular generation. They're very artistic. They're very frugal. Again, being the children of the Great Depression, probably not so surprised about that. They are a smaller group than both the GI and the Boomer generations. Now, the interesting note about the silent generation is there has never been a president from this particular generation. We're not really sure why. A lot of different theories on that, but there's never been a president from this generation. There are three areas of influence in our culture, primarily arts, academics, and philosophy. So not very politically minded. Now, of course, they may still be interested in politics, but not really interested in politics, not like the generation before them, the GI generation. Now, members of this group, Martin Luther King Jr., Ted Kennedy, and George Carlin. Just some examples there of the silent generation. Let's move on to the next, the baby boomers. Born 1943 to 1960. Now, this was an indulged generation. They were brought up to think they were very, very special. They are very self-absorbed. They are quite distant, for whatever reason, from their parents. However, the interesting thing about that is they're very overactive parents themselves. They're the helicopter parents that you've probably read about online and in different media outlets. Now, they went from being hippies, at least the older part of this generation, to yuppies, materialistic. So they went from nature to materialism. Now, they expanded work hours and FaceTime. That's what they think gets you ahead. And so they basically have spent their entire lives trying to be loyal to companies who, interestingly enough, were not loyal to them. This is the group that first saw massive layoffs and people being fired, even senior staff being fired, so their loyalty didn't matter so much. They do more than they're asked to try to impress whoever it is they think they need to impress, whether it's family members, whether it's their supervisors or bosses or whatever. But you ask a baby boomer, generally speaking, to do something, they're going to do more than you've asked them to do because that's how they think it's important to get ahead. Now, rejection and redefinition of traditional values. They decided that whatever their parents and grandparents liked, they didn't like. So they rejected that. That's why you see a lot of the hippies. That's why you saw a lot of the war protests and things from this particular generation. Their areas of influence in culture, vision, values, and religion. Members of this group, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, and Steve Jobs. So they have a lot of vision, a lot of values, and they try to redefine values and traditional values as well. So let's move on to Generation X. They're dubbed the slacker generation by boomers, who a lot of them had boomer parents. Now, interesting about this is that slacker generation is because boomers, now there's been a lot of studies about this, the reason why they have been dubbed slackers, excuse me while I take a drink here, they've been dubbed the slacker generation by their boomer parents, mostly because they don't work like the boomers. They don't think that doing more is impressive. They think that you need to be able to do things as quickly and as efficiently as possible without having to go overboard. If you ask them to do something, they're going to do exactly what you ask them to do. They're very pragmatic, very individualistic. Now, again, you have to realize that they had a lot of boomer parents who you had both the mother and father, if you had a two-parent household, that both of them worked full-time. So these Generation X people ended up staying at home by themselves, so they had to be very independent. So them being pragmatic and individualistic probably isn't too surprising. They're realists. They're self-reliant, very independent. They reject the traditional systems and the status quo. They don't like answers like, well, we're doing this because we've always done it this way. They want to find the most efficient and fast way to do something and then move on to something else. They want authentic leaders. They don't want to be told that this is going to happen and this is going to happen, and yet it never actually comes to fruition. They're loyal to people that they work with, people that they hang out with. They're not very loyal to companies in general. So what does that mean, and why are they like that? Because they saw their boomer parents being laid off by all of these companies, by these corporations, after their parents have slaved away, just basically worked their butts off, become workaholics, never going to any of the stuff stuff that the Generation X people had going on in their lives. They were left alone. The latchkey kid situation that you heard a lot about in the 80s. Well, they're very loyal to people. They will move with the people that they respect. They will not be loyal to specific companies because they know that the companies aren't going to be loyal to them. To most Generation X people, FaceTime is extremely unimportant. Speed and efficiency are the most important, as I said before. FaceTime, what that means is time in the workplace, time in front of somebody. Time, that's not as important to the Generation X. They think that being able to do things quickly and move on or go do whatever it is that they want to do is more important. Now, this is the smallest generation of this group, only because it had a 1 in 3 abortion rate in this particular time in the United States. Their areas of influence: liberty, survival, and honor. Members of this particular generation: Barack Obama, Jeff Bezos, and Kevin Smith. Those are just 3 examples. Now let's move on to the next one, the millennials, the biggest generation. Now, the Gen Y generation is the biggest generation of the bunch, born 1982 to 1999. Very coddled generation, very protected. These are the helicopter parents that I was telling you about, those boomer parents who are involved in every aspect of their children's lives. They're very optimistic generation, very family-oriented, overly confident. Now, there are a lot of theories about why they're overly confident, and a lot of things. A lot of people have the thought that because of the helicopter parents and their parents telling them that they can accomplish anything at any time, that may be the source of that. I actually read a very interesting article about why you see so many bad people on American Idol. And because it's this generation, the millennials, who have been told their entire lives that they're awesome and they can't fail at anything. So the reaction that they get when they're told that they don't get to move on from American Idol, that is honest surprise on their faces. Now, I mean, the people who are watching are thinking, really? These people think that they're good? But the reason is because they have been coddled. They've been protected their entire lives thinking that they can do no wrong. And so when somebody actually is honest with them, it devastates them. They're very discouraged by failure. They're discouraged by people critiquing them. They will completely shut down, especially in any kind of negotiation. If you say that they're incompetent or something like that, I mean, I don't know why you'd be quite that harsh about it, but if you say that their way isn't good enough or won't work, they're completely discouraged and will shut down. They need constant positive feedback. They want training and advancement opportunities faster than the generations before them. Now, that's why a lot of boomers and a lot of Generation X members have a hard time dealing with millennials, because they think, you know what, I had to work for 10 years paying my dues, and you hear that a lot. I had to pay my dues to get where I am. Well, I think that in a lot of cases, just from my experiences, that the millennials they don't care. They'll ask for things that the Generation X, the Gen Xers, and the boomers never considered asking for. They just took it the way it was, and people told them that they had to work for 10 years before they could move up. Well, the millennials don't care. They'll go ahead and ask for it now. They're also loyal to people, not companies, just like the Generation X. Now, they are the largest generation. They're very connected when you talk about technology and connected to each other. Their areas of influence in our culture: community, affluence, and technology. Members include Mark Zuckerberg, Paris Hilton, LeBron James. So you can see they're very coddled, protected, very overly confident. You have no idea why they're acting that way. Discouraged by failure, want constant positive feedback. But it's very interesting. These are very social, very connected generation. They enjoy social activities more than probably any other generation. In fact, they are the most sharing group of anything, where there's no filter when it comes to what they share. And you can see that based on different Facebook postings and things like that from people of this generation. Now, the 2020s, this is the newest generation. So these are still kids, little kids, a lot of them not in the workplace, not really having to negotiate too much with them at the moment. But these are the children of the 2000 bust and the 2008 depression. So that's something to keep in mind. It's going to influence how they act as young adults and older adults. They prefer cooperative group work rather than individual. So if you've got Generation X, the people who like to work by themselves, generally speaking, they may have issues working with these 2020s as they head into the workplace. Strong belief in fairness from this group. They're very impatient. They're said to lack deep thought. And I question that particular thing. I wanted to include that just so I could bring it up. But impatience I can see, because this even is my kids here. But the lack of deep thought, I think that's situational, really, because they may not be thinking really deep thoughts about specific things. But if it's something that they're really interested in. Like my son is a member of this generation, and when it comes to, let's say, monster trucks, he can go on for hours talking about every aspect of how monster trucks are built, how much they cost, how much the tires cost, how long it takes to put one together, every driver of all the monster truck. I mean, he knows more about that than anybody I've ever met before, but when it comes to other subjects, he's just not interested in it. So I think lack deep thought has more to do with whatever the subject is. I think it's more about subject and less really about interest there. So you might consider that whenever you're negotiating with them as they get older. They are smaller than the millennials so far, but again, we're not done. So it should be interesting if we have another baby boom at some point as we head closer to 2020, whether or not that will change. They like instant gratification. They do not want to wait. Now, how is this going to affect personal finance for this group? That remains to be seen, but I know a lot of people have started writing about it, and they're very, very concerned about how this particular generation is going to react to personal finance and saving and things like that. Their three areas of influence are arts, academics, and philosophy. Now, we don't really have many members of this, any notable members to talk about, again, because they're such a young generation. Now, so there are some combinations. Whenever you're entering some sort of negotiation, you might want to consider not having these combinations because the generational groups just will not get along. If you put silents and boomers in there, since the boomers have silent parents, it's probably not going to work out too well because they're very distant from that particular generation. Boomers and Gen X. Again, boomers think that Gen Xers are slackers, so they don't think that they're going to put in enough time. And it's a very, very hostile situation a lot of times when you put boomers and Gen Xers together. Gen X and millennials, they don't get along either because Gen Xers tend to think that the millennials are coddled, that they're incapable of being independent because their parents are always involved in their business. Millennials and 2020s, they're not going to get along. As you see the younger teenagers now and the younger kids, you can see there's this distance there between them. Despite the fact that they all have the same interests, especially when it comes to video games and things, they're not very similar when it comes to their generational groups. So those are some bad combinations. If you're going to set up a negotiation or if you're going to negotiate with something, you might notice that these groups tend to not get along. The silents and the boomers and Gen Xers, the Gen Xers and the millennials and 2020s. Now, some good combinations, if you want to have a positive negotiation, these are some ideas of the groups that you can get together. Put a silent and Gen Xer together. They have a lot of similarities. The same is about the boomers and the millennials. They'll get along because the boomers will relate to the millennials based on that's the fact that they're kids or grandkids, and the millennials will relate to the fact that that's like their parents or their grandparents. You can also put the Gen Xers and 2020s together. Again, we haven't had a lot of need for that, but sometime in the future, it's usually every other one. That's the way that these generational groups work. They get along better with not the next group from them, but the next one after that. So the silents and Gen Xers are good together. Boomers and millennials are generally good together, as are the Gen Xers and 2020s, which we will see in the coming years. All right, so that's the mashup today of the three different presentations. And again, I have very specific presentations for each of those three things: generational conflict and grouping and theory, cultural, and also gender-based negotiations as well. So that's just an overview that I wanted to share with you today. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can do that on the website, financialconflictcoach.com. You can email me, coach@financialconflictcoach.com. You can find me on Twitter. I'm at Money Conflicts. Also, my YouTube channel you can find there as well, and it's under Money Conflicts. I appreciate you watching, and hopefully I'll be able to talk with you soon.